Kennedy's statesmanship in the Cuban Missile Crisis cannot be understated. He saved the human race, and it was pretty much up to him. If he had listened to his generals and invaded, the Soviet Union, the generals said, look, just invade. They don't have nuclear weapons yet, and we've got overwhelming force. We'll just crush them. They only have, in the Soviet Union, they only have 12,000 troops on the island. The 82nd Airborne can wipe them out easily, okay? What the Joint Chiefs didn't know was that the Soviets didn't have 12,000 troops on the island. They had 45,000. And they didn't know that the Soviet commanders in the field had tactical battle nuclear weapons. And their instructions were they could only fire the nuclear weapons with authorization from Moscow or if they themselves came under attack, okay? Otherwise, they could not fire their weapons. If the US had invaded, they would have used their nuclear weapons. And US doctrine at that point would have required massive retaliation against, I think, 50 cities in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, their doctrine was if we get hit by a nuclear attack, we'll attack 50 cities in the US. Okay, so if Kennedy had succumbed to the advice of his generals, we would have had a nuclear war that killed 10, 20 million people. I mean, the world would have been disfigured forever. And in the deliberations about what to do, Kennedy called together all of his advisors. There were about 24 people from State Department, Defense Department, CIA, personal advisors, called them together. And when the crisis first started, when they realized the Soviet Union were building missile bases in Cuba, he took a poll. What should we do? And the vote on the first day, I think the vote was 15-9 to attack. Okay. Kennedy, the president, was in the minority. If Kennedy had gone with the majority, we would have had a nuclear war and 20 million people would have been killed. He held out because he said, we don't know what we don't know. Like the generals were very confident, we'll blow them away. Kennedy was like, no, I don't want to do that. So he negotiates his way to a peaceful settlement, shoots up in the polls because people were scared to death, and rightly so. The world was probably 48 hours from a nuclear war. And at the height of the missile crisis, this is a story that came out later. At the height of the missile crisis, Kennedy sends RFK, his brother, to see Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador here in Washington. And RFK goes to him and says, look, Mr. Ambassador, we're not negotiating anymore. We've offered you this deal. You move the missiles out, we won't invade, and we'll end this thing. We're not talking anymore. If the president has to go on much longer, he may be overthrown in a military coup. And we know this because Dobrynin went back and reported it to Khrushchev. And Khrushchev wrote about it in his memoirs, which were later published in 1970. So Kennedy was facing a military coup, and he pulled it off. And he shot up in the polls. He was lauded as a statesman, a man who had pulled the world back from the brink of war. And he learned a lesson, which was how crazy it was that he was going to go to a war over Cuba, a strategically unimportant country, tiny, no threat to the United States. With the missiles gone, it was, there was no problem. The generals were furious, and that doesn't quite capture it. The generals thought that Kennedy had the advantage and he had given it away to the communists. So he was actually helping the communists. That was the belief among the upper echelon of the Pentagon and the CIA. It wasn't just that Kennedy was weak. It was that he was really like a traitor. And he had betrayed the Cubans, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And in 1963, Kennedy becomes a much more dovish president, okay? And early in his first year in office, he'd been kind of a conventional Cold Warrior. In 1963, and this is the part that people should really study about the Kennedy presidency, because it is why the president is remembered. is his actions at the Bay of Pigs, at the Cuban Missile Crisis and after. In March of 1963, he cracks down on Cuban exiles who are attacking boats going to the Soviet Union. He's turning down the heat on Castro, searching for ways of accommodation with Castro, much to the fury of the CIA and the Pentagon. In June, he gives a speech at American University here in Washington, which people should watch, where he calls for a strategy for peace. And he says, we need to end this Cold War. The people of the Soviet Union are human, just like we are. And we need a way to live with our differences and not be on the brink of war all the time. In September, he forces through a limited test ban treaty over the unanimous opposition of his generals, a kind of confidence building measure where if you couldn't test your nuclear weapons, you'd be less sure that they would work. And so you'd be less likely to use them. It wasn't a big deal, but at the time, it was an important symbolic first step. How can these two nuclear superpowers, with aggressive ideological visions for the world, how can they live with each other? And Kennedy's trying to establish that. Well, all of that was anathema to the people in the CIA and the Pentagon. And this hatred of Kennedy by the fall of '63, was quite visceral. And another thing that we've learned over the years, that we learned from the release of the JFK files, is that there definitely was a conspiratorial, anti-democratic mindset in the upper echelons of the Pentagon. Hey everybody, I wanted to call your attention to one surefire way to deepen your knowledge of the assassination of President Kennedy. And that's to read my 3 books about the CIA, a trilogy of spies that tells how the assassination actually unfolded in the eyes of CIA insiders. You see, my work on JFK's assassination is rooted not in the literature of conspiracy, but in the history of CIA operations. And that makes all the difference when it comes to understanding the events that culminated on November 22nd, 1963. You'll want to check out my 3 CIA books that tell the story of the founding generation of the Central Intelligence Agency and what 3 insiders actually thought about JFK's assassination. Meet charismatic Station Chief Winston Scott as he surveils Lee Harvey Oswald 6 weeks before Dallas. Meet urbane CIA Director Richard Helms as he fends off President Richard Nixon's attempts to blackmail him over JFK's assassination. Meet James Angleton, the ingenious, paranoid, and sinister counterintelligence chief who had controlled the agency's file on Oswald since 1959. In these books, you'll see the real historical foundation of the events that led to President Kennedy's assassination, and you'll understand this event in a much deeper way. Check out my books at jeffersonmorleybooks.com. You can buy all of these books there, as well as my other nonfiction book, Snowstorm in August. So check out the Trilogy of Spies.